And then we just have to do that. Move this. Hi, Adam. Yeah. Sorry. And I'm just gonna move this. And oh, hey, Eric, can you hear me? You're muted if you're saying yes.
I sure can. Yep.
Good.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
I'm so excited. I wish I could be there in person. This is a really neat.
Yeah, it's nice. I'm still working on some tech stuff, so.
Okay, I'll let you go.
Okay. Good. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started because this session is a full one. Welcome to part one of Psychoanalytic Associations. I'm Mike Fortune. I'm the chair and organizer of the session, and I will only just say how excited I am to have this going. I've been chatting for a long time with Amanda about doing something like this and finally made it happen. So it's great, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the talk. So I will just leave it at that and introduce our first speaker, who is Adam Frank from the University of British Columbia on subjectivity in science studies. And he is slideless.
The Zoom is here, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you don't need to be on camera, and so if you really would rather sit.
Well, it's such a small number of
Yeah.
us. I wonder if it's okay.
Yeah, we just need to take the microphone wherever you're going.
If it's okay with you, then I will sit. Seems a little.
I'll just ask you to speak into that mic. I will. Turn it.
Hey, I have a slightly altered title, that is to say, I have a subtitle, which is Subjectivity in Science Studies, or Keeping Faith with Beyond. So first, many thanks to Mike Fortune for assembling these panels in psychoanalysis and science studies. I'm grateful for this, one of a handful of opportunities that have recently come up to return to a project that's been percolating with a very low simmer for a while now. This old or new project is tentatively titled Mad Science, or a Survey of Motives for Criticism. It tries to unfold the inevitable place of and roles for what may be called subjectivity. Now, subjectivity is a word I've tended to avoid in favor of more technical terms associated with affect and object relations theory, specifically the work of Sullivan Tompkins, Melanie Klein, and Wilfred Dion. And while this conference offers something like a warrant to grapple more directly with the term and its concepts, I have feelings of trepidation that arise from several sources, but especially from an awareness of the many disciplines context of discussion here at this conference that make any synthetic approach to subjectivity in science studies impossible. This trepidation will keep me company today and perhaps lead somewhere. Now, in general, science studies has not been attuned to subjectivity when that concept is understood to name an inevitable compositional, psychic, and social agent in the making of knowledge. While feminist science studies has thought a lot about subject position, or narrowing situated knowledge and standpoint theory, science studies has mainly addressed questions of the subject, best produced in and by the sciences, or subjectivity is what must be controlled or managed in the development of varieties of objectivity. Stephen Chapin makes a similar point in a discussion paper published in 2011, a while ago, where he observed how often in science studies, quote, subjectivity is called upon to conflate objectivity. The two notions go together as doppelganger, good child, and evil twin. Now, these unintegrated dynamics of good and bad child, or good and bad breast, point toward my engagements today with Dion's post-Kleinian epistemology, his attempts to convey in writing those practices of intuition and models for thinking that fully embrace Freud's notion of psychic reality. Few scholars have addressed the potential of psychoanalysis to play a significant methodological role in science studies, as if a generalized Foucauldian allergy has been absorbed into the transdisciplinary body of the field. Evelyn Fox Keller, John Forster, and more recently, Eshel Shah and Elizabeth Wilson are some years. So where Chapin turns to 18th century aesthetics and discourse of taste as a historical resource for thinking about intersubjective consensus formation, my more phenomenological approach has so far taken up the notion of style. An essay that I published a few years ago, which redescribes Keller's famous treatment of Barbara McClintock's scientific style in the feeling-critic organism in terms of affect theory, argued that there was a missed opportunity to follow a Bionian path rather than the one Keller takes via Winnicott, both in that book and more explicitly in Gender and Science, the collection of essays from the 80s. And after her 1992 book, Secrets of Life, Secrets of Death, and its Kleinian readings of fundamental fantasies of science, Keller moved away from psychoanalysis. 20 years later, when I spoke with her in a visit to the SDS group at UBC and mentioned working on Beyond, Heller remarked that she had been very intrigued by his work, but wondered, how do you use it? This question, which acknowledges Beyond's uncanny writing style, off-putting in a way that Winnicott's hominess never is really what fills me with trepidation today. Attention and Interpretation from 1970, the work that will be this paper's focus, begins, I doubt if anyone but a practicing psychoanalyst can understand this book, although I've done my best to make it simple. That's the first sentence of the book. All right, a word on trepidation, borrowing from Latin, whose meanings range from the more affective of agitation, confused hurry, alarm, to the more physical or physiological, tremulous, vibratory, or reciprocating movement, vibration, oscillation, tremor. When I attend to the feeling of trepidation that accompanies preparing this paper, it appears to be the opposite of intrepid, brave, adventurous, willing to advance despite danger. Trepidation gathers fears, my basic diffidence, what makes me want to cancel this trip to Hawaii for fear of getting on an airplane or crossing the international border during wartime or making thoughts public, all possible sources of trepidation. But there is something more specific insofar as the word is an adequate name. That is, insofar as it fulfills one of its basic functions, is what Bion would call a definitory hypothesis. Trepidation as both agitation and oscillation, a fearful step forward followed by a step back, arrives at the dynamics of thinking itself, as Bion proposes to understand these things. A movement between declining positions, paranoid schizoid, and depressive. He offers the notation PS, bidirectional arrow D, PSD, to name the to and fro movements that involve one set of ideas going to pieces before a new set of ideas can be synthesized or integrated around a selected fact, a phrase that he borrows from Henri Poincaré. So here's a quote, the selected fact is the name of an emotional experience, the emotional experience of a sense of discovery of coherence. Its significance is therefore epistemological. Now, Bion was well read in the history and philosophy of science. The biographer has called his writings from the 1960s, collected in the books Learning from Experience, Elements of Psychoanalysis, Transformations, Second Thoughts, and then finally Attention and Interpretation, the epistemological period. And several commentators have remarked on the range of references and the role of a handful of influences in his efforts to move toward a more scientific psychoanalysis and a more psychoanalytically informed understanding of science. Despite few explicit citations, readers may recognize repeated references to Hume's consonant conjunction, a commitment to a Freudian mathematical formalism in the infamous grid. I don't know if you've read Bion. Grid is this mathematical formulation at the beginning of all of his books, almost. And concerns associated with logical empiricist writing in the 1930s and 40s. The work of a lesser-known British philosopher of science, R.B. Braithwaite, was particularly relevant for Bion's tentative to develop psychoanalysis on the model of a scientific deductive system. That's according to a recent essay by Barnett and Malin. Malin's in-depth reading of Bion's long journal entry from early 1959, titled Scientific Method, argues in persuasive detail how this entry contains the kernel of the epistemological project that was developed in the decades that followed. Some excerpts from this journal entry will give you a sense of how Kleinian theory inflects questions of scientific. Here's a series of questions. Quote, is a hypothesis the meeting of mental events which in a moment of union begin a process that issues in a change we call precipitation? Quote, elements that appear to be constantly conjoined are implicitly stated to be so by being associated with the word itself then having some of the characteristics of. Quote, it is true to say that in actuality, a stream of elements exists, some of which are seen to unite at a moment that, like the elements themselves, is selected by the predisposition of the observer and is seen to issue from a process of change dependent effect. Okay. So for Bion, scientific method and learning more generally, as it includes hypothesis, precise vocabulary, and explanatory models, necessarily involves emotional experiences that should be taken into consideration in philosophy of science. But at least two other things emerge from these quotations. Beyond sophisticated constructivism that sounds to my ears as a reader and scholar of Gertrude Stein, like Gertrude Stein's composition of explanation. These would both be examples of what Stephen Meyer would call robust empiricism. And his strangely precise, intensely dry, but deeply felt style. I was surprised to note how finely tuned and developed these ideas appeared in a journal entry with, quote, raw ideas not intended for publication, as Malin puts it. They were eventually published in the book Cogitations and then as part of the complete works. In a reading group that I participated in during the pandemic, one of the participants, Michael Moon, described reading Beyond's transformations as an encounter with a very adept, extremely high-level administrator. Which is one way of characterizing Beyond's use of language as it seeks to control, direct, and manage association. Naomi Winter-Vincent's wonderful short piece, Another Uncanny, with Wilfred Beyond, describes the concern to avoid evocation of the conundrum of association as characteristic of especially early Beyond. This quality accompanies his scientificity, as if the goal of creating precise, provisional, shareable verbal meanings motivates an exalted administrative style that weaves and turns in unexpected directions as it tries to stimulate an awareness of what Beyond will call non-sensuous reality. Beyond has essentially fully taken on board Freud's rather thrilling assertions towards the end of the interpretation of dreams about the unconscious consciousness. Freud, the unconscious is the true reality of the psyche, its inner nature just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and just as imperfectly revealed by the data of consciousness as the external world is by the information received from our sensory organs. As for consciousness, Freud goes on to say it plays a role analogous with perception of a sensory organ for perceiving psychic qualities. So that Beyond is fully taken on this notion of consciousness, sensory organ for psychic qualities. So my ongoing hunch here is that there may be something valuable to science studies in Beyond's uncanny scientificity, and what accompanies it, a rigorous subjectivism, a term that I don't quite know the meaning. The rigorous subjectivism in which the individual, the subject or the thinker, subsides in the experienced thinker. The larger mad science project wonders whether and how post-Kleinian subjectivism can serve the resource of criticism, especially by way of the countertrends. And relatedly, whether a theory of fictionality can be evolved eventually from post-Kleinian writing. For today, however, I'm moving very slowly and simply notice that so far the selected fact of my paper is the observation of Beyond's administrative style. And in focusing on this description, my trepidation in its oscillatory movements begin to settle as I find some security in home discipline and skills of reading and criticism. I remain unsure how to locate or contextualize this style. Does Beyond's Anglo-Indian colonial background, he was born in 1897 in Punjab, and military training, he was a tank commander in the British Army in World War I and director of psychiatric military hospital during World War II, play some role in the development of this style? Did his analysis with Samuel Beckett in the mid-1930s?
Battery 70%. Connected to her.
So, I don't know yet. I am certain that understanding something about the style will help me to use it. Now, Beyond's efforts to scientize psychoanalysis in the 1960s encountered the problem, as Malin puts it, of producing, quote, psychoanalytic common sense or other methods to perceive and measure clinical phenomena, and relatedly, what Wittgenstein calls the impossible dream of a meta. Nevertheless, his scientific ambitions remain audible in the subtitle of his last book of this period, Attention and Interpretation, quote, and here's a subtitle, A Scientific Approach to Insight in Psychoanalysis in Groups, a book which moves uncomfortably between quasi-mathematical formulations, suggestions for cultivating the analytic intuition through the suspension of memory and desire, breathtaking assertions about the unknowable of ultimate reality, or what Beyond calls the O, clinical case studies, glimpses into the history of religion, meditations on the fundamental role of lying in communication, further elaboration of his earlier work on the mystic and the group, and more. So it's quite a ride to read this book. Readers hoping to find in this book a step-by-step guide to developing their insight may be disappointed, as the meaning of scientific expands and transforms from its association with didactic systems, transformation that aligns with the shift from early to late Beyond. Thomas Ogden, in a sensitive essay that compares reading the later attention and interpretation with the earlier learning from experience, describes late Beyond this way. Quote, the reader is pushed to his limits and then some, talking about his experience, in his effort to sustain a state of active receptivity to every possible experience in reading. If reading early beyond is an experience of learning from experience, reading late beyond is an experience of disencumbering oneself with deliberate use of all that one has learned from experience in order to be receptive to all that one does not know. The key phrase here is deliberate use. For Bion's writing asks us to have become acquainted with his and many others' previous ideas, to have integrated them into our vocabulary and thinking habits, and only then to forget them, to liberate ourselves from them. Consider, for example, this exciting, rather perverse instruction. Quote, the reader must disregard what I say until the O of the experience of reading is evolved to the point where the actual events of reading issue in his interpretation of the experience. Too great a regard for what I've written obstructs the process I represent by the terms he becomes the O that is common himself and myself. My sense then from reading Bion over a longish period of time is that O, which now I'm going to define O according to Bion, which stands for the absolute truth in and of any object. It is assumed that this cannot be known by any human being. It can be known about, its presence can be recognized and felt, but it cannot be known. It is possible to be at one with it. That it exists is an essential postulate of science, but it cannot be scientifically discovered. But all this is slightly less mystical than it sounds. O plays the role of an epistemological premise, much like the concept of nature does for physical sciences, as Isabel Spengler's put it in Thinking with Whitehead. Nature is that about which relevant knowledge may be produced. If we pay due attention to it, we can learn, discern relations, and multiply entities and ratios. For a practicing psychoanalyst, O is the reality of the clinical encounter between analyst and examinee, which is why Bion begins the book by insisting on psychoanalytic practice, condition for understanding. And here's the paragraph, or half paragraph that follows from the first sentence that I quoted earlier. Any psychoanalyst who is practicing can grasp my meaning because he, unlike those who only read or hear about psychoanalysis, has the opportunity to experience for himself what I in this book can only represent through words and verbal formulations designed for a different task. They were developed from a background of sensuous experience. Reason is emotion's slave and exists to rationalize emotional experience. Sometimes the function of speech is to communicate experience to another. Sometimes it is to miscommunicate experience. Sometimes the object is to achieve access to and permit access from a good spirit. Conversely, to deny access to a bad spirit. The vocabulary forged from such material serves, though inadequately, when, as in psychoanalytic practice, the object being studied is present. This is not possible the moment the conditions for psychoanalysis in the narrow technical sense do not exist. He goes on. So what motivates Bion's administrative style is an acute awareness of the difference between the sensuous experience that serves as a background for reading and those emotional experiences that take place with what he calls an at-one-ment that may lead to truthful interpretation in a clinical encounter. How can one write about experiences of coming to knowledge, which he calls the K domain, that depend on the transformation or evolution in O in the clinic? In a chapter titled Reality, Sensuous, and Psychic, Bion offers, quote, rules for the analyst that will help him to achieve the frame of mind in which he is receptive to O of the analytic experience, including most famously the suspension of memory and desire alongside what he calls active faith. In the sense that Bion is reaching for, quote, an active faith is peculiar to scientific procedure and must be distinguished from the religious meaning with which it is invested in conversational usage. It becomes apprehensible when it can be represented in and by thought. While Bion's description of the regulation of memory and desire as making possible heightened forms of observation sounds a lot like Daphne Gallison's description of trained judgment, what I find intriguing is what it is that Bion seeks to observe, hallucination, that is, the patient's transformation of an element of psychic reality into a sense. And while Bion, along with other members of the Kleinian group, worked extensively with psychotic patients, which is something to keep in mind when reading about discussions of at-one-ment and efforts to see what the patient sees, hallucination, in his understanding, is not simply pathological. Quote, I consider it rather to be a state always present, but overlaid by other phenomena which screen it. If these other elements can be moderated or suspended, hallucinosis becomes demonstrative. Bion's goal in regulating memory and desire is to permit the analyst, quote, to participate in the state of hallucinosis through an act of faith in which he call this a rigorous intersubjectivism, and have to speculate that it's affiliated with Barbara McClintock's synthetic experiments in physiological self. So I'm suggesting that Bion's uncanny writing style with its dry delimitations of association that suddenly open out onto strange vistas of psychic reality is a crucial aspect of the form scientificity takes in his later work where it bases scientific state of mind and should be recognized. What motivates this style is Bion's commitment to communicating his methods, for keeping in touch with the reality of the clinical encounter, a commitment that itself involves an act of faith, so the commitment to communication also involves. Quote, it is essential that the language be preserved, he asserts, in the context of a discussion of the inevitable threat posed by the explosive reciprocating dynamics of container and change. And he goes on, the fact that the world's work has to be done by ordinary people makes this work of scientification or vulgarization or simplification or communication or altogether imperative. There are not enough mystics, and those that there are must not be wasted. In good faith and in bad, the work goes on. Oh, sorry. Didn't.
Thank you, Adam. Our next speaker is not only a high-level administrator, she is the supreme level administrator of the 4S. Amanda Windle. I think nope, wrong screen, wrong window. Shut all these down. Huh? No, it was in Firefox. Is there? That's what I thought. Let me, let's see if I can get it. It's in a different. Let's just try and see if I can shift window. Yes.
We're still seeing the email screen.
Ah,
Okay, let's try this again. Well, let's try this. You seeing it now, Eric?
Yep, I sure am, and I can hear you too. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike, for that help. I've just set my timer so I don't overrun. Okay, so this is going to be a very much an alt-ac presentation. I'm no longer in university. Yes. I am the managing editor of Engaging Science and Technology Studies, and that's going to inform some of my talk today. And I'm also a training psychoanalyst, pluralistic psychoanalyst. I've done 2 years of clinical training, taken a pause to do more work on myself. And this is where I've got to. So the abstract had a lot of ellipses in it, but it definitely had love. And that's staying in the next kind of working title, as this probably moves more towards a written piece than a spoken piece. I'm going to entwine psychoanalytic, existential, phenomenological, and STS associations in relation to case note writing, publishing vignettes, and I'm going to talk about aesthetic infrastructure in our relating. So let's start with a recipe for love. Let's begin with my love of case writing, the writing of Sedgwick, Eve Sedgwick, Lauren Ballant, Lewis Gordon, and Juliet Mitchell, not Stephen Mitchell. We're in the UK, not America right now. Let's follow a desire path with another love of mine, the editorial love for the 2M dash in writing case notes and thinking about case notes and publishing vignettes. If you learn anything from my presentation, it's how to use these. Top is an M dash, middle is an N dash, and the one at the bottom is an hyphen. I love the M dash. The M dash is an alternative to commas, parentheses, and colons. An N dash is the one you put between numbers. Everybody forgets to use it. They often mistake it for the hyphen, which can be used for prefixes like this phenomenological one, being in the world. The M dash is part of a family of punctuated mark making relating to the hyphen, N dash, and M dashes. I love it. And to give a Winnicottian phrase, it's the good enough punctuating dash, and we'll use it to explore with case writing. So here's a snippet from Engaging Science and Technology Studies. Here is the top. Here is a 2M dash. And then at the bottom, that's a 3M dash. So not only do you get a 2M dash, you get a 1, 2, and a 3. Here's the geopolitics of the dash as a nation-making standard. The Oxford Manual of Style says to use an N dash and use it with space either side, which for me kind of feels like a Brexit sort of metaphor. In the Chicago Manual of Style, the American way of using it is an M dash, and there are no gaps, it's completely closed up. And you can see the difference in how I've taken Evelyn Fox Keller's citation here and used it in the 2 ways. Digitally, this is how to use an N dash or an M dash. The Unicode for it, if you're trying to do your HTML, is U+2014. The keyboard shortcut for Mac, sorry, I don't know what it is on PC, it's Shift Option Dash. And not all fonts display M dashes. So for example, ESTS uses the font Merriweather, but all 3 M dashes are in Source Sense. There's an aesthetic to a 2M dash, and it's much more than the technicity I've just explained, especially for attuning to the interdisciplinarity of STS writing. So let's free associate for a moment from the dash technicity, from 2M dash as a rarefied language of journals in many Englishes, to be inspired by its aesthetic and stylistic choice. I have a background in design. So we're going to think about words in this stylistic aesthetic of the place between words. And I'm going to use the form of haiku because Eve Sedgwick wrote her book on a dialogue with love with her therapist using haiban, which is a mixture of haikus and prose. So this is just haikus at the moment. A haiku basically is a rhythm of 5, 7, and 5. This is the English version of a haiku rather than the Japanese. What's a dash? It's a middle line, a long line, a geometry, a going from, a coming to, a division, a pause, a pace, a break, a breath, a sigh, a silence, a stage, alliterate. Musicality, a rhythm, a measure of time, a voice, a voice in silence, a gap, a hold, crutch, prop, and an adjunct prop, a styling emphasis with line, word absence play, a mediating space, spiriting magic, temporal placement, as an effective affect, a gasp, I'm feeling. A double editing of author and their thought, intervening edits of the intervening path, a social desire, pathways of defense and resistance, and what of therapy, of psychoanalytic case studies, transference, symbolic function, the lateral axis of Juliet Mitchell, what of existential, phenomenological, flatlines, horizons, the aesthetic, 2M dashes, equation, sublime, transcendental, transitional, abstraction. So what of it in psychoanalysis, STS, and typography? What of it to the theme of this conference? Of its relation to land, sea, and sky, and its relation to the oceanic, to the feminine, to what Freud could not reach, la mer, el mar. The 2M dash marks its horizon between the point of the X height, some typography here, that's your X height, just slightly lower, that's where your M dash goes. And what of its musicality, of its silent voice? It has rhythm, a beat, like the tenuto mark. There is silence played at full length. Think of them like jazz articulation, when the tenuto is a do and not a do, dat, or dit. A dash is to words like Alvin Lucia, Yoko Ono, and John Cage are to the music of unspoken musicality. And what of the horizon and phenomenology of the 2M dash? It's not a dividing line like this one, but a communal line of a shared horizon. They make communal sentences to articulate broken thoughts coming together, a separation of day and night, sunrise and sunset, of our shared communicative horizon lines and our futures of possibility. The M dash is prevalent in STS writing, as it is in poetry and autobiographical writing. It's prevalent in the writing of the affective and psychoanalytic literature of Cedric and Berland, the existential psychoanalysis of Lewis Gordon, and the STS writing science of Evelyn Fox Keller. And it shows up in my case writing in STS, and it also shows up in my psychoanalytic case note writing from my clinic sessions. It can be a break in back-to-back prose. So let's turn to Lewis Gordon, to his use of the 2M dash, but also to think of writing at large. Writing takes on that extraordinary hubris of making ideas transcend the self. Even diaries aren't written in private languages. The intellectual has a love affair with writing. It is no wonder that psychoanalysis and deconstruction made love in the world of literary theory. Writing as orgasmic, but often, very often, spiritual and magical. Science for me was a creative world, and he cites Evelyn Fox Keller. Writing, look at the 2M dash, genuine writing is magical. And so he says that he defends in his writing the thesis that genuine writing is in the end, a form of incantation. To write is to perform magic. So to follow Gordon, if words are to magic, then I think it follows that punctuation is to spirit, the spiritual infrastructuring of text, of infrastructuring of very visible, spatial and silence. Some might even say oceanic. And let's turn to Juliet Mitchell, to her psychoanalysis, her Freudian and Kleinian psychoanalysis. The individual, and we're going to turn to the M dash as a lateral axis, and this builds on her work and her current book from 2023. The individual and the social are one and the same person or people, yet in nearly all analyses, our entire focus is the vertical axis of the individual in the family, child to parent, parent to child. The individual is always also a social person, which we know in STS so much, in lateral relations, enacting as such on a horizontal axis. This axis is of a social sexuality. It is also the axis of the mother and not the father. So in Lacan, it's all the name of the father, it's all vertical axes. With Mitchell, it's lateral axes. Gender, death, and lateral relations, phratriarchy, not patriarchy, are bound together as the neglected or rejected subject matter of psychoanalysis. It is the axis of bisexuality and transgender. Sexual difference is denied in the lateral axis, and she goes on and on and on, but I can't share with that all. It's a structuring of the social in psychoanalysis that draws on object relations of Winnicott, attachment theory with Bion, and feminisms like Simone de Beauvoir, which links us to existential phenomenology and philosophy. It's the mother's law. It's not about symbolism or symbolic relations. There is an unimportant horizontal gender distinction among adult collaterals, but no virtual sexual difference. Thinking about an independent but also autonomous horizontal axis necessitates, to the contrary, considering a social unconscious, which comes about at the very site of the construction of the social. So now to think with Berland in her book published in 2022. The aim is not to get to the root of relation or to dominate knowledge, but to affect the infrastructure in which relation forms, a relation that explicitly reminds them constantly that is ever also non-relational. Infrastructures are social and performative toward their internal and external interlocutors. One of her most beautiful examples of using the M-dash is in the acknowledgements at the back of the book. Here she says, finally, and of course, the inspiring work of my dear friends, interlocutors and co-editors, Sadia Hartman, Erica Rand, and Katie Stewart, has held me in the world. Writing matters, how it interferes. It's up to us to take up and do something with what hooks us. So now thinking with Sedgwick on the dialogue with love. It's a dialogue of her psychotherapy towards the end of her death and towards the end of her life, infused with Freud, Klein, Bolas, but mainly, if not entirely, on the side of Sedgwick's reflections. It's written before Sedgwick passed away, and the book was written, as I said, in Haiban, a mix of haiku and prose. Sorry, there's a Z in there for some reason. On the left, you can see her use of the haikan and the rhythm, the 5-7-5 rhythm of the syllables. On the right, you see one of her examples of using the 2M dash as a haiku. And then below, you see, so the top one's written by Eve, and the bottom one's written by Shannon, her therapist. And what we're getting to here is the therapist's notes and the therapist's case note writing. Shannon writes, late making notes on this session, little memory, something of the calm after the storm of the last couple of sessions. And Eve writes above, too good a question to get a yes or a no, plus I am still breathless. A lot of affect within that. So I can't share with you any of my clinical case notes, nor would I if I wanted to. These are entirely fictional, but they're taken from my reflections on a couple of years of case note writing through giving therapy in the UK. And I've written these with the M-dash and how I use the M-dash in my writing. And also I've done it in a haiku, because why not? And for the last speaker, Adam, you can see there's a K in there, so you've got a little bit of B on the bottom. Apples, parent. Have as many as you like. Great. How many is good enough? I rush our patient because I'm thinking beyond a guilt for prior pace, sped up thought, a rushing through prior reading. Who knows? I go back to the body. At what point? I can't read that. To cry. I asked, would you? I want to speak, but end session. I feel bad about feeling, bad. I'm driven in there towards an end. The last session and then this moves to supervision as a clinical therapist. Supervisor says, you're caught up in a slip, the copy editing, the experience in the process, migration, windrush to the right, passivity, the apologies, crisis team status, discharged. And then I want to give you an example of me thinking through what I think of journal case writing when they appear in ESTS. And you might see that I quite add a lot of M-dashes in my editorial moments. Transnational copy editing can be magic. The 2 M-dashes are. So towards my conclusions, these were kind of my concluding aims, because I would like to do more with this work than the introduction today. I wanted to show you how to infrastructure M-dashes in STS, both poetically and technically. I wanted to think beyond language, to consider the M-dash as an existential and psychoanalytic infrastructure, as firstly a phenomenology of a horizon, and two as a lateral axis of thinking through Lewis Gordon and Juliet Mitchell. I wanted to show you how the 2M dash is used in STS through the work of Evelyn Fox-Keller, and affect theory through Cedric and Berlant. And I wanted to show how I'd applied it to my editorial work, and upon reflection to my past case note writing as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in training. And my contributions are simply these at this stage, because I actually don't know whether I need to do any contributions given that I'm no longer in university. Gordon, he gives an attention to race in Existentia Africana, two examples of Rasta dialogue using the 2M dash, and he performs a particular kind of magic. So with his attention to race, he tells us that words are magical and transcendental, but so too is punctuation in case writing. Cedric shares her dialogue with her therapist, and I have done the same with training therapy as a working fiction to show the law of the mother as applied to the 2M dash. And finally, the 2M dash has got style. It can be found in the writing of STS, affectual and psychoanalytic writers and editors that I hope continues to inspire us, because transnational copy editing can be magic, and 2M dashes are. Thank you. They're typed. And I've been advised to handwrite. I've also been advised to type. I've also been given very little advice on how to case note write, except for the risk that make sure that everything that you write is not just for you in terms of your thinking, but also that it has a further implication and a public implication. So everything that you write down could go to inquest. Everything you write down could be shared with the family or with the person that you're writing with. So it's a very difficult form of writing, and the 2M dash is more than an ellipsis. It's about those relationships and those struggles. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just gonna shift it over to this tab so that we don't have to, sorry to make you all look at that online, but I don't want to lose that tab. Our next speaker is Perna Strigyan from UC Irvine in the Department of Anthropology. Pedagogical biographies, a psychic archive for the sciences, histories of learning with difficult to know objects.
One person I have a conversation with, though she was not good yet, is Chandra Prescott Einstein, physicist slash astrophysicist slash feminist STS scholar, Black slash Jewish slash agender slash woman slash queer. So she's many things, as is evident from the fashion. But she's also the first Black woman to earn tenure in particle physics and cosmology theory. She published in 2021 The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred. It is a book that came out of a blog where she started to keep track of all the demands that she encountered, being all the things that she is, and of all the ways her presence demanded something different from physics. And even though the book came out of a blog, it has taken a life of its own. The New Scientist calls it an insider take on physics and injustice. Smithsonian Mag ranks it among the top 10 science books of 2021. The Los Angeles Review of Books blurb notes that it opens up with some very heavy science, but at the heart of the book is a consideration of how social construction of science foments a toxic culture. That understanding may help us to do better science. And a reviewer in the feminist essays journal The Catalyst makes a case that it is a book you can give to someone who loves good writing. Then there is also the other side of it. One review on Goodreads scorned, this book has nothing to do with astronomy or astrophysics or even science. Another reviewer asked her to read Anna Against the Totalitarian Century because Chandra was not using the word right. I came to the book because my teacher, Mike Fortune, said I should read it. If I want to approach the question of political consciousness in science education and in the sciences, by reading narratives of life spent doing science. In the same conversation, recommended that I read Mike Fisher's 1991 essay, The Reuses of Life History. The essay proposes that one way ethnographic writing can draw in the relationship between people and the world is by the strategic use of a live brain. Especially figures like Chandra Weinstein, who signal major cultural and social transformation, critique their own traditions, and bring their fuller selves to bear upon the text. Life histories also need to be opened up to display their aporials and contradictory questions, he suggests. And one way to do that is being attentive to psychodramas, symptoms of transference, displacement, identification, resistance, deferral, and so on. A recurrent reason that I am drawn towards psychodramas in the teaching and learning of science is because education has psychical consequences. Not only do we have to learn when we are the least prepared for it, we have to make learning out of experiences that were never meant to be pedagogical. Along with healing and government, Freud called educating an impossible profession. In these professions, Freud said, one can be sure beforehand to achieve unsatisfying results. Certainly, the state of science education seems to be highly unsatisfying. Carl Sagan's cosmos is not enough. Lives and fortunes are spent on getting people like Chandra to identify as a science learner. When the data suggests that they don't, the search for the problem begins. Is it because science education does not know how to think about culture? Could culturally relevant science pedagogy be an answer? What about teaching teachers about anti-racist science teaching? What about justice-oriented science? Teaching empathy and allyship. These are some traits that I learn about when I visit science education events designed to transform the social and political culture of science. Only if you could get kids hooked to science and for teachers to be adequately prepared in content matter and pedagogical are these impossible demands. When I started formulating the question of the relationship between affect, learning, and science, Mike Fortune also sent in my inbox Deborah Buxman's essay, Theory in the Garden, and Shazana Kundan's essay, Psychoanalysis and Education, Teaching Terminalism and Impermanence. So my psychoanalytic education began, which would continue with a seminar in psychoanalysis and culture that Mike put on the calendar of UCI Anthropology. It is the only course in psychoanalysis in a department that is singularly socioculture. So I learned from Feldman that Lacan confronted the problem of learning by talking about a passion for ignorance that keeps us from being able to encounter new knowledge, lest the anxiety of fragmentation take over. The teacher wants to give significance to students by holding them responsible for learning, and yet the students also want teachers to exercise authority and call the master within them into significance. In this dance of transference, even though the figure of the student and the teacher are preserved, the possibility of a new learning disposition is destroyed and is experienced as loss. Chanda actually loves Sagan's cosmos and goes to annual Star Trek conventions. She was marked as a highly gifted child who knew before she was a teenager that she wanted to go to Harvard and MIT to study physics, and she does that and much more, establishing herself as a highly successful, award-winning blog writing astrophysicist who is also a voice for diversity and inclusion. So do we want more science learners like Chanda? I learned from Deborah Blitzman that this is a tricky question. In her book, After Education, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, and Psychoanalytic School of Learning, which informs the basis of much of my paper, Blitzman asks, what is education that it should give us such trouble? She reconstructs the debates in psychoanalysis and education in the 1940s called the controversies that are played out between the supporters of Melanie Klein and Anna Freud. The controversies had to do with the place of psychoanalysis and education, especially the role of child analysis. Supporters of Anna Freud maintained that a psychoanalytic education could be useful for teachers and students because it would allay the pain of integration by reality. That is, even before the ego has had a chance to be formed, defenses start to begin. Attachments to authority, dependence, helplessness, anxiety. So instead of trying to drive the difficulties away, a psychoanalytically informed teacher could encounter the uses of those difficulties by helping to interpret fantasies and by tolerating negative therapeutic reactions from the child. So supporters of Melanie Klein, on the other hand, worried that child analysis would lead to the gross identification of the child with the analyst and prevent individuation. Klein's analysis with her own son Fritz, or the failure of it, had permitted her to understand the infant child as a creature with a kernel of aggression. Born into helplessness and dependence, the infant engages in persecutory behaviors to control her surroundings and gain knowledge about them. And Klein argues that the first instances of this are displayed towards the mother, who is the source of both nourishment and anxiety for them. Building on Freud's concept of this drive, the knowledge drive, or epistemophilia, Klein suggested that the infant's appetite for knowledge is a defense against anxiety. So this is the first experience of love and of learning, and contained within it are also hatred and loss. So when I read the first part of Chanda's book, which is called Phase 1, Just Physics, I remembered what it is like to be in the presence of someone who knows her story and knows her stuff. Chanda studies loop quantum gravity, one way to combine quantum mechanics and general relativity. It is a bold proposal advanced by Chanda's advisor Lee Smolin that curves space-time to come in discrete units, knotted together in patterns that appear continuous on larger scales. The cosmos could be a cotton shirt if you disorder, if you look too closely. This disturbs the proponents of string theory because it does not include particle physics, something that physics students learn that is true and good early on in their careers. The search to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity has driven what some have commented as a quantum century, when the foundations of how we understand the universe becomes unraveled, even as that knowledge is mobilized to unravel many words like atom. Chanda admits to being a beneficiary of this legacy. She says, the standard model of physics, that's how I fell in love for the first time. And yet in this love, there's also loss. The standard model of physics is the dream child of particle physics and is understood to be mostly complete. Novices to quantum mechanics learn to love the standard model. Chanda is deeply worried that her love for the standard model blocks her from seeing a larger picture, a different picture. For her to work on loop quantum gravity has meant to tolerate the loss of her love towards the mathematical elegance of the standard model and learn to be at home in messier territories of knowledge problems at the foundations of cosmos, problems that don't receive enough funding. It has also meant a loss of who she could dream, a dream deferred. A phase transition occurs for her when Carl Sagan's feeling of the sublime towards physics escapes in the struggle against the mundane and pervasive forces of oppression. This Black Jewish kid from a working class neighborhood in East Los Angeles does not attempt to be like Sagan, even though she pays homage to him. In addition to joy and wonder in her text, there is also anxiety, abandonment, betrayal, and pain. Unlike Klein's son, Chanda does not experience an inhibition of curiosity. She has excess of it. Some people would be more comfortable if she did experience that intuition. Instead, she is Klein's question child, terrorizing her mother by persistently questioning a born empiricist. This excess of curiosity is also why her anxiety becomes painful. She is not denied in her capacity as a knower of physics, but she is denied in her capacity as a knower of race. How is it that students in physics can perform extremely complex mathematics to detect distortions in space-time that enable them to know how many galaxies are there in the universe, and yet the pattern recognition of racism, mundane and otherwise, is denied? How is it that students in physics can come to understand the universe as a multiverse and yet cannot take care to learn about pronouns? So what is the struggle with empiricism? In a 2020 paper published in the Feminist Science Studies journal Science, she comes to identify this dissonance as white empiricism. The exclusion of Black women scientists in physics has deeply impacted physics epistemology, she argues, both by flights of scientific thought that couldn't happen and by the lack of historical scholarship on Black women and queer scientists. In her memoir, she lists names of scientists, Black and otherwise, who were similarly denied recognition. Elmer Imes, Henrietta Swan Leavitt, Jocelyn Bell Burnell, Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, Vera Rubin, Maria Mitchell, to name just a few. I am worried to talk about the pain of being denied recognition as a knower, because many people are in the business of talking about Black women's pain and doing nothing about it. It can be interpreted as voyeuristic and can be encountered with suspicion. I feel like it is not my place. And yet her text opens the way for me to also feel otherwise. Just as Chanda is a beneficiary of the quantum century, I propose that she is also the beneficiary of what Julia Kristeva has called the psychoanalytic century, ushered in by the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, the continued unraveling of the mind-body with the displacement and erasure of a diaspora of psychoanalytic thinkers. Like quantum mechanics, psychoanalysis is understood to be a domain of white empiricism until you watch the film Black Psychoanalysts Speak and learn about the psychoanalytic roots of radical pedagogy. In the film Black Psychoanalysts Speak about the double work that the denial of capacity as a knower and thinker does. It disavows what you can claim as expertise and who you can count as your ancestors. They also have to contend with the problem of belonging that Chanda is. Why persist and thrive in a field that undermines your humanity? How to learn from knowledge that unmakes you? So Chanda has been a good student and a good friend to physics, but she has not experienced reciprocity in it. So the innovation of Deborah Britzman's reading of the Klein-Freud controversies is in a very reparative mode. Klein's epistemophilia is useful in encountering this avowal of knowledge and passion towards ignorance. Though there is a kernel of aggression in desiring to know, there is also the wish for a relation. Anna Freud's ego psychology is useful in permitting to ourselves the susceptibility and influence of the other. So she also allows us to respect the wish to disrupt the wish. Of the two, she is the one who stayed with the trouble. And even though the two did not meet very often, they did meet in their later years in correspondence that they shared with their friends, but not with each other. So they met in how they approached loneliness. Chanda is the first of many, and in this there is profound loneliness. Her wish for an ancestral relation is deconstructed by the fourth law of archival erasure, and it finds much comfort there in the knowing that there were many like her who were also scientists before the word was invented or could be applied to them, but it also meets loss. Should she count Oppenheimer as an ancestor? What about Caroline Herschel, a woman who may have denied during her lifetime that Chanda was a human being? So Chanda visited an exhibition about the astronomy brother-sister duo, William and Caroline Herschel, at the National Air and Space Museum. She felt seething anger on seeing that Caroline was dismissed as a mere assistant to her brother, and wrote a review criticizing the exhibit in Smithsonian magazine. She was met by the response by a senior curator that Caroline would likely have called herself an assistant rather than a scientist, because that is how women identified at the time. The trouble is pressured by a previous chapter where Chanda pointed to the necessary work that assistants, caregivers, and non-academic staff also do for science. So in returning to a beloved childhood side of learning as an expert, Chanda experiences loss even as she feels solidarity. So in this aphoria, there is loneliness. Loneliness is a transitional space and a transitional object, as Winnicott would argue, reading Klein. Winnicott would understand this as learning to live with the other's mindfulness, a reparative position that allows the reconstruction of prior relations. Klein follows loneliness with what can happen after the glamour of idealization has gone, suggesting loneliness as a counter to idealization. For Anna Freud, loneliness resides in the loss of history, or the fate of being a stranger. Identification with the lost object of love can bring the ego comfort that there is always another. As the poet Maya Popa says, wound is the original wonder, who would not, given a creation another's mind, lie there for a while to watch the sky be sky. So Chanda knows a thing or two about seeing the sky. In Hindi, my first language, her name translates as the child's mood that comforts in the dark of the night. In recounting her visit to the Atacama Desert in Chile to watch the sky through the Magellan telescopes, she's filled with intense wonder but also intense grief. Why are kids like her growing up in Los Angeles denied this relation to the night sky? So this grief is experienced as loneliness and sets her up to take responsibility for a relation that she knows from deep empirical relation and experience will be profoundly asymmetric. So in choosing an activist life, Black feminist life, Chanda has lost many friends and opportunities. She declines an opportunity to work at the Mauna Kea Observatory because she cannot cross the picket line. And she acutely experiences the loss of this opportunity. She is forced to reevaluate her affective relations to physics and to the physics community. And in doing so, it happens in a way that does not turn her away from physics, but reinvests her with significance towards it. So in considering some dimensions of the psychic archive of the sciences, we encountered theorizing in the loneliness of science, or learning to tolerate the asymmetry of relations that is the work of loving. Somewhere along the way, love for justice, in the sense of anticipating symmetry and reciprocity in psychical and political life, is exchanged for maintaining the objects that will not be destroyed, despite repeated attempts of persecution. What could this mean for education and science? It would mean that good students would learn how to disappoint their teachers and themselves by loss of idealization and by confronting the loneliness of it. It would mean that good teachers would learn how to feel lonely in the crowded space of the classroom, where a daydreaming student is not experienced as a threat, but as a necessary accomplice of faith. And yet, to make from these wishes a wish for a relation to science, it should have sufficient anxiety so as to provoke the circuitry of interpretation. That is also the work of the psychoanalytic. Thank you.
Come back up. So you,
Thank you, Amanda. I think I started thinking about the fold of archival erasure because Deborah Britzman's work started making me think about if the wish to archive is encountering the death drive again and again, what is the wish to educate and to influence? And that is how I started thinking about the uses of epistemophilia and how the loss of love in desiring to know could also be experienced in reconstructing the history of learning. And in reconstructing the history of learning, it's difficult because you have to make education out of experiences that were not meant to be pedagogical. And so the reparative mode has to be set in some fashion. And I also thought about the work of Anna Freud and how she was encountering this history of loss, because she was writing about loneliness at the time when she was older. So this was like 20, 30 years ago after the controversies. And she was saying that it is a wish to disrupt the relation, instead of the wish to preserve it, that could then provoke circuitry of the push and pull that is Forda. So yeah.
All right. Next up is Cristina Mejia Vesperas with Race in the Genome, Knowledge as Repetition Compulsion. Oh, oh no, okay, you're good.
It's just that I
Okay,
didn't have the foresight to print it.
Okay.
so.
do you want to?
Oh, yeah, actually, that would work if I could sit down. That would- And so in the spirit, I extend that recognition to the whose structure of suffering suffered colonialism, apartheid, the largest open air prison in the world, and now most especially ethnic cleansing and the second lockdown. Sea, sky, land, in solidarity, I add my voice to those millions around the world who demand a ceasefire and a free health.
Excuse me, is it possible to go to the microphone because one cannot hear it at all, and it's such a pity to not be able to listen and to attend and be eager to listen to it. Sorry to interrupt you from the outside. No,
So you need me making it super complicated.
thank you so much. That's now. Thank you so much again. It's really lovely. Hello from
problem, no
Germany, from
problem.
the middle of the night.
I'm
I
glad we
love to
can-
hear what you're saying. Thank you for coming up.
So I want to start my talk with this feature story that was published in the April 2018 issue of the National Geographic magazine. That issue was called is called the Race Issue, and it marked the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This was a moment that, as then newly appointed chief editor Susan Goldberg wrote, inspired the magazine and should inspire its readers to, quote, talk about what's working when it comes to race and what isn't, unquote, and to, quote, confront today's shameful use of racism as a political strategy and prove we are better than this, unquote. Notably, Goldberg recognized that the magazine's racist coverage during its 130-year history demonstrated what was not working when it came to race. Its treatment of non-white, non-Western cultures and communities ranged from omission to, quote, every type of cliche, unquote. In an apology some readers considered a long time coming, Goldberg addressed the magazine's colonial beginnings and fetishes, which together forwarded essentialist ideas about race and hampered the making of inclusive communities the magazine now wished to help build. Tracing the history of race science from Timothy Morton's long debunked study using skulls to determine brain size and intelligence, to modern day genetics research that helped map ancient human migration patterns, the issue calls race, quote, a largely made up label used to define and separate us, unquote. Science tells us, writer Elizabeth Kolberg begins, quote, there is no genetic or scientific basis for race, unquote. Implying that, much like National Geographic itself, the more advanced sciences of today can correct and repudiate the falsehoods of their colonial origins and legacies. Focusing on the science of genomics, the race issue expounds on the shared lineage of all human beings and the richness of genetic diversity therein, stating, quote, in a very real sense, all people alive today are Africans, unquote. So the headshot you see on screen visualizes this sentiment. Placed before a large blurry screen is the subject Ryan Linger Miller, whose unadorned face, neck, and shoulders become the backdrop for the 4 bases of DNA. Projected onto his visage, the component A's, T's, G's, and C's of DNA are in neon colors of the rainbow. These colors correspond to hazy figures on the screen behind Linger Miller, suggesting that they too are DNA bases. In the background and foreground, the genetic code surrounds Linger Miller. The caption tells us that Linger Miller is, quote, a Ugandan, unquote. But rather than particularizing him, this detail is made to bolster a general claim that, quote, DNA reveals what skin color obscures. We all have African ancestors, unquote. To invert this obscuring effect of skin color, the photograph masks it by overlaying Linger Miller's skin with a genetic code. Like the projection screen behind him, Linger Miller's skin carries and transmits this lesson about universal kinship, collapsing medium DNA with message, African ancestry. His face, his individuality, overshadowed by the human genome and the universe around him suffused by it, Linger Miller can stand in for all of us. More than that, he is a living relic of who we once were. So National Geographic has its own, or had its own genetic ancestry test. It was called Geno 2.0, and it was discontinued in 2019, but it purported to reveal, quote, your story, our story, the human story, unquote. But like other commercial genetic ancestry tests, Geno 2.0's claim to universality rests on its stated ability to quantify an individual's ethnic or racial composition. The technology's promises are contradictory, offering narratives of racial transcendence and human connectedness in the form of narrow genetic lineages and precise breakdowns of personal, ethnic, and racial makeup. In other words, race isn't real because it isn't everybody. So how to study this contradiction? STS incorporates a varied and indispensable ensemble of critical approaches through which science can be studied. For instance, science is culture, with its own conventions, languages, assumptions, and situated actions, all of which compose rich material for close scrutiny. With quote-unquote nature and technology, science forms a network or an assemblage of human and non-human actors, a processual being becoming distributed across asymmetrical agential capacities. Contrary to popular belief, science is not the value-free, progressive accumulation of facts, but a shifting paradigm negotiating different interests, disputes, and emerging data. Science is a powerful institution whose claims to objectivity and supposed privileged access to truth belie its role in shoring up authority, domination, and capital. However, science exists not solely as the domain of the powerful, but as a contested and differentiated site of knowledge production, also taken up by those at the margins of accepted expertise. Finally, science motors technological development and yet cannot exist without instrumentation, raising questions about the historical, ontological, and moral relationship between scientific thinking and machine doing. I'm sure I'm missing something from this awfully simplified list, but collectively, these perspectives, which do overlap, help locate sociality and politics, human or otherwise, within the workings of scientific rationality and technical practice. As an SDS scholar examining race and racism, however, I'm starting to think science is or is also neurotic, a subject persistently clinging to an object or an idea that it had already refuted over and over again. This is what I find most striking about race in the sciences, not that it persists, but that it returns, and often in the very same language that destabilized it. The successful sequencing of the human genome at the turn of the century, a multinational and multi-billion-dollar enterprise occurring at both public and private institutions, was lauded as veritable proof of a singular human race. Now, reifying race, genetic ancestry recalls STS sociologist Ruha Benjamin's warning, quote, "If race is technology, post-racialism is the genius bar," unquote. And its innovators are busy designing the latest features, deadly operating systems, and killer applications of next-gen racism. So I have no interest in rationalizing science, at least for this paper. I still think that's a very important project. But I'm not doing that here because science is already quite proficient at pelleting with corrected facts its own problems and mistakes. Indeed, the relationship between science and race typifies the postmodern condition of knowledge without change or truth without freedom. Naming this dilemma the elusive variability of race, legal and critical race scholar Patricia J. Williams writes, quote, "This sort of perception is not a matter that will be resolved by yet more scientific testing. Rather, I think this reiterated resistance to data is testament to the persistence of human imagination," unquote. That reiterated resistance to data is my concern. And of course, this is why I think psychoanalysis has a lot to offer STS methodology. To Jacques Lacan, science gets off on knowledge. And here I'm citing Bruce Fink. Continuously pressing at its own powers of explanation and reaching for what remains beyond its grasp, all to push its objects into yielding a fact or a proof that, and this is key, is ultimately unsatisfying. For science, knowledge is an end in itself, though always lacking, and therefore always leaving quite literally something to be desired. Thus, in Lacan's formulation, science isn't about expanding what we know, but taking what we don't know as far as it can go. He called this discourse hysteria. Lacan is famously known for intervening in Saussurean linguistics through his return to Freud, comparing the structure of the unconscious to that of language. Like language, the unconscious possesses rules or systems of organization that one might call a syntax or grammar. However, Lacan also noted the unconscious does not follow exactly the structure of any human language, with slips of the tongue and other such symptoms betraying a fundamentally different logic separate from and resistant to conscious control. The signifying elements of the unconscious, hence, not about producing meaningful messages, but giving codes or ciphers to non-meaning. In short, unconscious truths do not and do not need to make sense. Dovetailing into contemporaneous theories of post-structuralism, Lacan's turn away from intentionality or intended meanings is also apparent in his construal of language as other, the big other, something necessary for the speaking subject to enter communities of other speaking subjects but something that does not and never has properly belonged to them. Popularly understood as a recipe, instruction manual, or book of life, the human genome manifests this other status of language, a material semiotic text at once within and without a body. But one surprising finding about the human genome is how very little of it contains sequences that code for proteins or that help regulate gene expression. Colloquially termed junk DNA, a significant majority of genetic material have yet to reveal their purpose, or in linguistic terms, their referent. Mutations in these areas are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, inherited changes at individual DNA-based pairs, which constitute the object of computation and interpretation in all genetic ancestry technologies. And this is where genetic ancestry tests provide novel ways for making meaningful what remains inscrutable genetic information or whose functions heretofore remain unknown. Reported or self-reported race, ethnicity, continent, or nation state play a crucial role in giving these SNPs meaning, labeling them and organizing them into data sets used for estimating by percentage points a person's membership to any of these pre-constituted social groupings. Social identity designates a cluster or pattern of inherited SNPs that then compose the reference materials for calculating social identity. In other words, ascertaining racial or ethnic makeup through SNPs proceeds with SNPs already arranged according to those markers, a tautological framework in which scientists confirm and reify the categories they begin with. And Freud, Bester, and Duane Wiley have written on that. Significantly, this means that to disprove race, genetic ancestry first recreates it through socio-technical entities that, if not nominally racial, underlie or coincide with popular typologies of race. It is important to note that no geneticist would argue there exist DNA sequences or genetic markers specific to race, ethnicity, or nationality. Geneticists are consciously aware that the identity categories they use are simply that, labels or instruments allowing them to do scientific work. And Jenny Reardon has written that. In genetic ancestry, social identity is proxy, useful for organizing, but not an essential feature of DNA sequences for which function or scientific significance is not immediately given. Race is but an abstracting operation, a primal signifier that arrests or retroactively fixes the meaning of these otherwise unintelligible molecular signifiers. Still, popular representations of genetic ancestry, like the race issue, demonstrate how epistemological questions mutate into competing ontological claims. A tool created to either separate or unite us, race is not biologically real. A composite making up all individuals, race proves us to be one human family. Genetic ancestry will have it both ways, where race does not and does not need to make scientific sense in order for it to ground or produce scientific claims. Indigenous feminist STS scholar Kim Tallbear has shown that genetic ancestry can reproduce colonial practices of extraction, appropriation, and classification, complicating how subordinated groups can engage with such technologies. Genetic ancestry, Tallbear asserts, quote, do not tell a story from the standpoint of those people who were encountered. They tell a story from the standpoint of those who did the encountering, those who named and ordered many thousands of people into undifferentiated masses of Native Americans, Africans, Asians, and Indo-Europeans, unquote. Extending colonial optics of recomposing the world, the phrase, we are all Africans, for example, innovate old ways of seeing and talking about difference inaugurated by the world-shattering arrival of Europeans. Like it did for early anthropology, conquest and its geopolitical aftermaths unify the molecular significance of ancestry. So race as both that which gives SNPs their identity, suturing them together into a meaningful network, and that which can then be located and reconstituted from this network enacts a repetition compulsion towards what turns out to be the traumatic origins of the human family. Tolbert and others illustrate not only that the symbolic order of colonialism and imperialism shaped the organization and interpretation of DNA, but also how ancestries moved to recuperate a past before, or perhaps without colonialism, remembers and cannot help but remember originary practices of subjugation. What is this genomic personhood, this molecular definition of the human, but a self with no other, a figure that, finding itself everywhere, infiltrates and seizes the difference in the other? Searching family roots is no innocent matter when genealogy interpolates its subjects and unevenly, and for some, not at all past a certain generation. And Alondra Nelson has written on that. So the race issue enjoins the reader, quote, forget race, ancestry is the real story, and it's much more interesting, unquote. Yet the reality of that story itself cannot forget race. It needs it. Whatever makes ancestry a real and more interesting story requires the racial fictions it disavows. For all its vaunted capacity for expanding self-knowledge, genetic ancestry becomes another way of taking what we don't know about the human as far as it can go by protecting it from its family history. Thank you.
Okay. I'm last. I'm Mike Fortune. As a part of my inquiry into epistemophilia and scientists, I've been asking myself, what texts in what genres have given me the most pleasure over the course of a long life of reading? And why, in that long life of reading, did I come so late to psychoanalytic texts? Where's my epistemophilic drive coming from and going toward? What bodies of knowledge have I been consumed and consumed in turn? Elizabeth Weed's 2010 essay, it's not going in. Reading for Pleasure has helped me pose these questions, and she describes three types of textual pleasures. The first pleasure she analyzed derived from texts of what she calls exuberant critique, the kind that in 2005, Bruno Latour said dominated STS, but had, quote, run out of steam. I'm going to pass that over now and just say that Latour gets quite steamed, exuberantly so, about his critique of critique. It's Weed's second kind of reading pleasure that I'll dwell a little bit on today, is produced by texts of capacious systems. Sorry, can't see that. Which have a hint of delusional systematicity, depend heavily on analogy and thematic structures, and gather in figures that do their suggestive work seemingly free from the pressure of contradiction. Weed analyzes this kind of textual, associates this kind of textual enjoyment with Giorgio Agamben, but I think it also characterizes Evelyn Fox Keller's work. Many of us have been thinking a lot about Evelyn lately and mourning her death. I've read everything she ever wrote, all with great pleasure. I wish I could say that had always been the case. I wish I could say that I had talked to her instead of just being around her at the Conference on Reconstructive Knowledge at Hampshire College in 1981. But at the time, my pleasures in questioning science and technology came more through reading a shice ton of Heidegger, including these essays that had then just recently been translated. Evelyn would have been working on the Barbara McClintock book in 1981, as well as the essays that would become 1985's Reflections on Gender and Science. I'm not sure when I would have made these few marginal notes in that book, but contextual clues suggest sometime around 1987 or 88, after I had started graduate school in the history of science at Harvard, a discipline in which, at least at that time, any theory at all was at best superfluous and more likely dangerous. Maybe that explains all these vaguely contemptuous vagues. What kind of clarity was I wanting? It seems clear to me now that I did not take much pleasure reading this, and I must have been completely uninterested in the remarkably extensive and astute use of psychoanalytic theory from Bruno Bettelheim to Jessica Benjamin, with a lot of Winnicott, as Adam said, and a bit of Leyvold and Kohut and Dinnerstein and Stern and many others sprinkled in. Nothing else Evelyn wrote had that same sustained engagement with psychoanalytic theory as the middle chapters of that book did, a turn that Adam Frank has also analyzed quite expertly. Why is this text, which I find such pleasure to read and think with now, so crisp and clear and full of meaning, so unsatisfying then? I don't remember buying Gender and Science. I do clearly remember standing in the Harvard University Press bookstore and pulling Bruno Latour's Science in Action off the Hurt bookshelf in the spring of 1988. I began reading everything Latour would write, soon adding everything of Donna Haraway's. But then Michael Fisher put Dissemination in front of me on my way out the door from grad school in 1993. And at the same time, Rich Doyle opened another book door, handing me a copy of Avital Ronell's recently published The Telephone Book. For the next 15 years, Derrida and Ronell were constant pleasures, Latour long expelled, and it was only through their texts that I encountered any psychoanalytic theory at all. The very different texts of Latour and Haraway nevertheless share a style of capacious systems analysis in Weed's terms. Their kind of pleasure stems from the expansiveness and dense connectivity of their texts. Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison's Objectivity also exemplifies this style, where intricate analytic structures branch out from a well-defined center, objectivity, that canonic center of a science studies fixated on the epistemic register. Objectivity's pleasure is that of capaciousness and closure and confirmation. Objectivity is marginal to Avital Ronell's The Test Drive, published the same year. Its no less exacting figurations harbor no hint of the organic. Its austere, intricate fragments are even hard to gather into some kind of a pattern, let alone as a centered, coherent structure, which partly explains why Ronell remained far on science studies margins, I think, even before the Ronell affair. Daston and Gallison's epistemic virtues for sure inform my writing of Care in Genomics with Care, but its scientist subject is a fully conscious neo-Kantian one, as Esha Shah has really nicely described, while the Test Drive figures scientists as more or less Nietzschean, subject to forces more unruly than virtuous, as are we, science's readers. Stupefaction, please hold on to that word, and astonishment open the scene of any possible knowing. Science truly amazes us, it fascinates, which is to say, it blinds us and may itself be blinded to its own trajectories, axiomatic presuppositions, procedures, and premises, not to speak of the unmarked status of scientific desire, whether in crisis or on the contrary, but this is not a contradiction, self-assured and well-funded, state-supported. So much blindness compels an inward turn, or at least a staggering movement towards something like a philosophical outside. Oh, reader, I staggered, clutching this quote and Ronell's book for more than 10 years, trying to get to something like a philosophical outside, but settling for some markings of a scientific desire that had remained mostly untheorized in STS. To analyze the self-assured, well-funded, and state-supported sciences of genomics differently than I had before, I dialed down stupefaction and astonishment to read genomics and genomicists for what Sylvan Tompkins' neutral affect of startle, surprise, and the more positive affect of interest, excitement. Being surprised or startled in Tompkins' analysis functions like a reset button to shift attention out of its habitual patterns of excitement, When surprised by a mutant fly larva, Christiane Nusslein-Volhard's utterance "toll," translated from the German as weird, strange, crazy, became my recurrent mark for the first turn of a test drive's crank, rather than the more enjoyable ooh or aha that sounds its epistemic shutdown. I loved the capacious systems that opened up for my theorizing, which in the end I gathered under the sign of epistemophilia rather than the test drive. The philia linked to another capacious system of theorizing on friendship that I was trying to think through as a not fully erotic, but still affectively charged relationship to an other that could be either the scientist next to me or the DNA sequence data next to her. A capacious and strong theory of epistemophilia, I thought, could underwrite that any possible knowing in that Ronell quote. Pedacock summarizes Freud's scattered remarks, first positing an epistemophilic drive as an imperfect negotiation of anxiety that is simultaneously induced and relieved by knowledge. In my book, that clearly pharmaconic force of knowledge as both product and cause of anxiety, angst, care, is most apparent in a genomicist's relationship to the avalanches of data that they became able to produce. An overwhelming chaotic excess that was a source of both epistemic riches and epistemic headaches, attention that could only be repeated in the production of another avalanche, a double bind and internally recurring impossible situation. Melanie Klein developed Freud's few thoughts into a more organized theory in which Freud's Wistrieb assumed a position as fundamental as the life and death drives. For Freud and Klein, anxiety is the prerequisite for thinking to even emerge, says Deborah Britzman. Whoops, sorry. In Klein's paranoid schizoid position, epistemophilia serves as a psychic defense, as Pedacock calls it, while a depressive reparative position later shifts the epistemophilic drive into another cognitive emotional style, one in which, quote, the ambivalence made from both loving and hating the same object devastates neither the ego nor its other. Bound to what Britzman describes as a kind of poignancy, thinking can come to tolerate in very creative ways, this is a quote, the anxiety that sets it to work. That kind of epistemophilia then builds psychic strength rather than a psychic defense. That's some capacious systems thinking there, capacious enough to accommodate Ronell's any possible knowing, capacious enough to group scientists and humanists alike into a set of epistemophiliacs, capacious enough to provide me with enjoyment and to feel good, to make it feel good and right and true. So naturally and or perversely, I would like to make that system even more capacious and try to resurface what got submerged in the translation from Freud's Wistrieb to Klein's epistemophilia, the drive concept. In Anglo cultures, drive shifts seamlessly to instinct, and there we find science studies difficulty, to say the least, of holding and thinking the biological other, other than as an inert, apolitical, asocial, and dangerous obstruction that social theory can only crash into if it doesn't swerve and avoid it. A theoretical anxiety that Elizabeth Wilson has analyzed in many feminist theorizations. More than a few anthropologists are similarly anxious about affect theory for its intimate association with the biological and the universal, and its distance from the more cultural emotions. They are also ill at ease with the word human, with its essentialist, humanist, universalist, naturalized and biologized as a truth of the West. It's a powerful and, if exuberant, critique of the human, but it only works by excluding, or at least being extremely disinterested in, the unfolding, pulsing, building wave of living matter, which is also dying matter, acting over what Darwin called unimaginable tracts of time. I soft pedaled the pressures producing evolutionary change as well as the drive or drives in genomics with care, but I left some threads to pull on. I suggested a genome-wide association study of genomic scientists to look for differences in Tompkins' affect of surprise startle in that population and comparing them to model organisms like zebrafish and mice that are used to study differences in the startle response. I want you to see that little exclamation mark by the mouse. In those model organisms, the startle response is dulled by environmental toxins like lead or PCBs. And my epistemophilic impulses really kicked into overdrive with recent news of the sequencing of the Octopus vulgaris genome, as large and complex as any X-ape's genome, sure to harbor many surprising insights into startle and even more complex behaviors. Those threads eventually wound their way to what anthropologist John Edward Terrell called the human talent for friendship, a revolved capacity for prosociality, behaviors that are both cause and effect of enjoyment, that affect whose function, according to Tompkins, is to support prosocial bonding. So where was I? Oh, drives and where they go. Triebe. Oops. Triebe und Triebschicksalen. Instincts and their vicissitudes. Here's all the time I have to say about that. Jean Laplanche deconstructs the drive concept, affirms it, and undermines it in The Temptation of Biology. A translation as questionable as Instincts and Their Vicissitudes. In a 1997 lecture appended to the main text, presenting his revised seduction theory for the origins of sexuality, Laplanche stops to ask his audience in Buenos Aires to do what they should have been doing all along. I must now request your full attention. He shuns the easy path where the acquired is founded on the innate. What we are obliged to conclude is frankly stupefying. In human sexuality, the acquired emerges not on the basis of the innate, but in fact before the innate. For Laplanche, the logic of the drive is frankly stupefying, a Nachträglichkeitisch action in which the drive seems to be backed up into itself, reversed into the body from which it lurches forward, an origin that's a destination, biology that was always already more than biological. Laplanche's echo of Ronell's stupefaction brings me back finally to Elizabeth Weed's 3 Different Pleasures of Reading, back to where her second one, produced by the kind of capacious theoretical systems that I've just indulged in, again, tips over into the third. Weed quotes Alan Bass on the knot of Freud's work, where the relationship of psychoanalytic theory to clinical practice creates a double bind. Its ethical stance in favoring of reversing defense implies the scientific stance that always has an ironic distance from the data of conscious perception and from its own inferential theories of unconscious processes. Freud's work, Weed writes, must aim to help the patient without promoting systems that are narcissistically gratifying to the analyst. It must draw on theoretical ideas, all the while remaining suspicious of theory. Another reason to call psychoanalysis an impossible profession, Bass says, is that to embrace a double bind is to affirm apparently contradictory positions. But the embracing of double binds is exactly what both system building and conscious perception intrinsically screen out. So Weed quotes Roland Barthes to distinguish her third reading pleasure, stemming from the theoretical encounter. Text of pleasure, the text that contents, fills, grants euphoria, the text that comes from culture and does not break with it, is linked to the comfortable practice of reading. Text of bliss, the text that imposes a state of loss, the text that discomforts, unsettles the reader's historical, cultural, psychological assumptions, The consistency of his tastes, values, memories, brings to a crisis his relation with language. I get off on the stunning stupefaction psychoanalytic texts conjure, the reset they do on me. And stupefaction, I think, is different than anxiety. Anxiety can easily get caught up in the narcissistic pleasure of capacious systems, texts, sciences, which then break down or reveal their incompleteness and thereby produce anxiety all over again. The Freudian texts, writes Weed, far from offering a consistent corpus, are constantly revisiting theories, unsettling them, revising them, seeing the old in new ways, posing new and tenacious enigmas. Like any other good science, psychoanalytic theory identifies these enigmas, impossibilities, and double binds that are internal to capacious systems. If epistemophilia enlists the life drive and the affects of surprise and enjoyment, then the test drive has to engage not only the life, but also the death drive, keeping in mind that life and death name yet another double binding enigma. Genomics with Care ends with a brief rendering of Catalin Carrico's work characterizing toll-like receptors, which taught her about how messenger RNA could produce a life-preserving immune response rather than a death-dealing inflammation, a piece of scientific sleuthing which years later would become the basis for the BioNTech COVID vaccine, and only a few years after that, the basis for her Nobel Prize this past October. I condensed her scientific work down to a few paragraphs, but since then, her published autobiography has come out. And I want to close by reading parts of Breaking Through that allegorize her scientific style. One allegory dominates the last climactic section where the narrative shuttles back and forth between mother and daughter as each work toward recognition. Daughter Susan goes from floundering UPenn undergrad to novice rower on a crew team to two-time Olympic gold medalist. Carrico talks about sports to talk about science. A race is a 6-minute snapshot. What the spectator doesn't see is all the years that came before of training, pain, blisters, doubt. What a spectator doesn't see is the grind or the passion and drive a person brought to that grind. As much as I'd like to play with the proximity of grind, passion, and drive there, I need to get to Carrico's second analogy. It's built around a nostalgic memory that I happen to share of the 1970s detective show Columbo, one of the few American TV shows permitted in the Soviet-controlled Hungary of Carrico's youth. What stuck with her is that in every episode, there's never a mystery. We see the murder happen. We see how the murderer, usually wealthy, does it. This quotes from her text. We know from, and this is my quote, we know from Poe, Lacan, and Columbo that the letter is always in plain sight. The drama comes from watching how the bumbling everyman can piece together the truth where every clue points away. What the young scientist-to-be remembers is how the resolution of every case comes about because of that line, just one more thing. Here's the truth. Scientific investigation can be tedious. It generates a lot of data, and sometimes the bulk of that data appears to point in one direction. It can be tempting to look for the data that fit one's existing narrative, and when you find that data, which you will, to feel that you've done your job. But you must do your experiments correctly. You ask one question at a time, then you change just one variable and ask again. And then you change the next variable, and then the next. Just one more thing. There's almost always just one more thing. You have to set aside the mountain of information. That appears to confirm what you expect and deliberately seek out the one thing that doesn't. Because that thing, that tiny nagging piece that for whatever reason does not fit, may, if you pay attention, point you toward truth. That very conventional philosophy of science carries a rich set of affective and psychoanalytic injunctions, but I'll only emphasize its reiteration of Elizabeth Weed's differentiation between the reassuring narratives of capacious systems and the psychoanalytic theoretical encounters that unsettle assumptions and consistencies and bring established narrative to crisis. Which means that I have to tell you just one more thing. I have to tell you about my anxiety about what I would like to call the Da Vinci Code, but will instead call the Leonardo effect. Freud's reading of Leonardo da Vinci as the knowledge-driven scientist was brilliantly creative, as well as wildly misconstrued, off-base, and in need of unsettling. The likelihood that my readings of scientists and sciences are also mistaken is not the main thing that worries me, though. It's more that, like Freud, I theorize from a very limited set of high-profile cases like Leonardo or Carico, because that's what gets my and everyone else's attention. That's who's there and who seems to deserve to be read, ripe for analysis, and are somehow representative even as they are exceptionalized. How would an epistomophilic or a test drive help me understand Vero and Lisa any better? I'm sure there's no Nobel Prize in the future of either of these atmospheric chemists who've come into their UCI labs day after day, year after year, employed not entirely precariously, but still always with the soft money of some faculty member's grant. They work and work and work to identify and characterize the particles and gases shed by automobile brake pads and tires. Are they driven, subject to compulsion? Does being on soft money mean you are not driven hard? Carico was in the same position, never getting the grant funding that UPenn expected of her, for which reason she would eventually be evicted from her lab. In a research area that's all about precise measurement, Vero and Lisa are themselves measured in their demeanor, not given to displays of excitement or exuberance. Their affective laboratory life is hard to engage and analyze. If they encounter some impossible emporia and double bind in their mass spectrometer data, I am not sure what it would be, and I am even less sure that some interpretation woven around anxiety or stupefaction would exert any performative force on them. I guess I would have to try it and see. Always back to the case, the clinic, the field, the empirical, singular, impossible, real. I'm still enough of a Weberian that science is a vocation to me, a driven epistomophilic vocation. But Vera and Lisa are my reminders that for most every scientist, it is also a damn job. No more elevated and no less alienating than other forms of labor, including ethnographic ones. Thank you. And we are over time. But if you're not running out to get something for lunch, I don't think there's anything else in this room for the next few minutes at least. And so would welcome any questions to any of the panelists or from the panelists to the other panelists and so on. Or lunch. Uh-huh. On war, yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. No. What do they go where? Uh-huh. Oh, go ahead, Anne. Unmute.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Good evening. Thank you for these lovely talks. I wanted to refer to first to Amanda's talk that I could hear, and all of them that I was able to listen to fascinated me very much. And then also I wanted to add something or ask something to you, Michael. Amanda, I really loved your way how you were working with the M dash, and it reminded me in the way that Anne Carson, in her interpretation of Sappho's poems, was dealing with all the dashes that had to be made because everything had to being cut out due to the loss of her whole poetry. And I found this very fascinating how you would connect all of this. And what I wondered was that in the psychoanalytic theory, the magical thinking is a phase, and it's a phase that is ending around 5, 6 years old, 7 years old maximum. And you were constantly repeating that writing is magic. So I wonder how you relate this kind of magical thinking that you found in the M dash and in the writing to this kind of notion of magic that you find in Freudian theory of the early childhood phase. And what is so fascinating about this is the aspect of animation and the possibility of the symbolic and the imaginary exuberance that emerges out of using the words and seeing the world. So that was one thing that I wondered whether you relate to this or whether you're also critical engaged to this kind of new idea of the magical thinking. I don't know whether you heard this. Now I'm speaking into the voice.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you for that. I wasn't thinking in particular of magical thinking, because I think of magical thinking as fantasy. And I think that's very different from Gordon's understanding of magic and magical. And I would say that's much more within existential phenomenology, philosophy. So yeah, magical thinking has a very particular, like most psychoanalytic words, particular meaning, but can also mean so many, many things, to the point like the word transference. I get to the point where I don't know what it means anymore, because there are so many different ways of thinking of that, whether it's Kleinian or Freudian or a negative version or a positive version. And in terms of the dashes and Rachel Carson's work, that was an incredible... Yeah.
Anne Carson.
Sorry?
Carson.
Oh,
I think her
Anne
name is
Carson.
Anne Carson. Yes.
Ah, okay. So I didn't know this. So I would love
It's
to.
a beautiful book. You will love to read it. It's wonderful. It's one of the most beautiful English written, in my opinion, translations of Sappho and engagements with Sappho. And
Yeah,
love. It's a love.
Yeah. I think I've seen Haraway's love for the hyphen, you know, with her Uncle Mouse and all the ways in which the words join. So I will add that to my collection to read. Thank you so much.
Yes, you will enjoy it. Thank you for that connection. And in case you haven't read it yet, Georges Arthur Goldschmidt's work on Quand Freud voit la mer, when Freud saw the sea or the seaside, is very beautiful too, because the German word See, so what he's not reaching to, is connected to the soul and to the breathing of the in and out. And Goldschmidt, who translated from German to French the whole Freudian work, was showing how actually when the French sees the sea or la mer, they see something different, la mer et la mer, while the German analytical thinking cannot see the mother. It's hidden, although the breathing and the in and the out is there, and the baby is reared within the womb. So anyhow, sorry, it's lovely. I really love your work. And and to Michael, I wanted to say, you were referring to those few and rare case studies, and you were in a certain way very polite and modest at the end, thinking that your interpretation of Carico or Freud's interpretation of the work that most of us maybe have had the pleasure to read are rare or exceptional cases. But I think what ethnography makes so beautiful, and I have been doing through long time research, especially amongst physicists at CERN, is that you're listening to those people that you just showed in the picture at the end, and that you're actually at the end you're able to somehow sediment. In German you would say verdichten, and dichten is to really compress, but it's also within the world of poetry to sediment a persona that allows you to somehow nail cultural or social or individual assemblages that become what Deleuze and others would call rhizome. And I think that's something that you do in your work very beautifully. And although you leave the big question mark at the end, I was amazed how you brought together those very, very different approaches from Ronel to Latour. Thank you very much.
Christina's first question was about O, and no, directed towards Adam, and then ego psychology to Perna.
Yeah. I don't want to say anything about O. Well, I think for Bion, faith in O is a requirement for the epistomophilic, for epistomophilia. Otherwise, it's nihilism. That's as far as I can understand it. So for there to be something that, for the analyst and the analysand to have anything to work with, there needs to be, as far as Bion is concerned, a kind of an evolution of a kind of thinking that has to happen in relation to them, which is, so I don't know how to put it. This is where vocabulary becomes challenging in Bion, and that's why he returns to the grid, and he keeps on using these kinds of formulas. Someone who's more trained in a psychoanalytic context, Amanda, if you want to jump in at any point. But so the transference takes place, as it were, in O. And then the evolution of those, those psychic realities permits or doesn't permit, sort of, it permits a moment when when one can say something in the domain of K, and the uttering of that thing will have some consequence. There will be an interpretation. I don't know, probably. Right. So I don't know that Ogden work, but I know that Ogden is very informed by Bion, and it sounds to me like this is what's happening. I mean, it's the fundamental Bion text is is a taxon linking, which is the beginning for him of the understanding of what can take place between the analysand and the analyst when thinking itself can't happen. Like there's an attack that is taking place on the possibility of making an association or a link of some kind, and that is still part of O, right? That is what is happening. So that's what I have to say about O for now. I don't know if that helps you, but Karina, do.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that the way Anna Freud is understood in the United States is could be why there's a collapse of socio-emotional learning and ego psychology. But actually, Deborah Britzman reads Anna Freud a bit differently, in the sense that there's a story that she says about Anna Freud's case called Robber Come, in which she talks about the anxiety that a young boy faces while experiencing a nightmare. He's afraid that a robber would come attack him in the night. And Deborah Britzman teaches with Anna Freud's case to teacher educators by asking them, okay, so what are you going to ask the child in order to alleviate this anxiety? And most of teacher educators, pre-service teachers that she has worked with, say that, we want to understand where the robber comes from. We want to understand, they're curious about the robber. But Deborah Britzman erases the question that Anna Freud would have asked, which is that, like, what if the robber doesn't come? What happens then? And so when the robber, that question leads to the uses of the night terror that the boy experiences, in the sense that it is stealing the robber, which is what a lot of a lot of teacher education would have do, is the discarding of anxiety in the classroom space, actually steals the boy's privacy and denies the connection to sexuality as well. And I think that is how we can understand the limits of socio-emotional learning that are practiced, especially these days in US classrooms.
Yes, we're starting again at 1:30. Yes, so session 2 starts again at 1:30. So I do want to get people. Yeah. Well, for coming. And thanks to you, Eric. We'll see you later.
Bye. Thank you for organizing this wonderful session.
Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, I'm excited.